Hello, I'm Louis Meyers, host of Meet the Author, and want to welcome you to our show today. Our guest is someone you may not recognize by visual, but I think most of our listeners will recognize his voice. Our guest today is Ari Shapiro, the longtime host of All Things Considered on NPR. He has quite a resume, and I'm going to highlight it briefly, and we have so much to talk about. Mr. Shapiro was born in North Dakota, moved with his family to Portland, Oregon area at age 8. This was before the show Portlandia and before Portland was cool. He eventually went east to attend Yale University, where he graduated magna cum laude. While at Yale, he also became involved in theater and sang with an a cappella group there. He migrated down to Washington, D.C., where he became an intern at NPR 25 years ago, and then an assistant editor at the Morning Edition. One of his mentors was the great Nina Totenberg, and after being in the Morning Edition, he went to cover the Justice Department as an NPR reporter. By age 30, he had become the youngest full-time correspondent in NPR's history. From 2010 to 2014, he was NPR's White House correspondent during the Obama administration. From 2014 to 2015, he was overseas as NPR's London correspondent. And while there, he covered war-torn areas such as Iraq, Syria, and Afghanistan. Along the way, he has also become a performer on stage, singing for many years as one of the lead singers for the group Pink Martini. And I think we're going to get to hear a clip of Mr. Shapiro singing with Pink Martini. And hopefully they'll be here in Burlington again sometime in the future. He also went on tour with stage and film star Alan Cumming in a duo called Och and Oi. I would just say in May of 2010, one pop culture magazine described Mr. Shapiro on its list of beautiful people, saying, quote, "He must have a clone. No one man could have so many talents and be in so many places at once," unquote. But we are glad that he is here with us today, Mr. Ari Shapiro.
Thank you so much for having me. It's a real pleasure to be here.
It took about half of our time just to read that. But I want to start at the beginning. This is your book, The Best Strangers in the World. It is a memoir. You are still in your 40s, so we hope that there will be other memoirs to come. But it's a fascinating book about the life and times and places you've been, people you've met, and a sort of philosophy of life that you've developed. Let's start at the beginning, which is where the book starts. Don't talk a lot about North Dakota, but really when you got to Oregon at age 8, your family was very involved in going outdoors. They encouraged you and your siblings to be outdoors. You traveled around the country in a car. That was sort of the family vacations. And you talk a lot about that in your book and about why that was so important. And I'll quote, you spent a lot of time in nature walks looking at tide pools, and you said it helped you learn to be curious. And you quote, "Today, when journalism students or interns ask me the most important trait for a reporter, I always tell them it is curiosity." Can you tell us a little bit about what curiosity means to you?
Yeah, I think the more you learn about the world, the more interesting the world becomes. And that's true whether I'm learning about the birds whose songs I'm hearing on a hike, or the mushrooms that are growing underfoot, or how legislation becomes policy, or what the implications are of a country going to war. I think that fundamental desire to learn about something new and that fundamental interest in going from a sense of ignorance to a sense of understanding is what keeps me motivated to keep learning about new things and to keep, waking up every day knowing that the great thing about journalism is you finish the day knowing something that you didn't know when you started the day. And so over the course of my career, when I went from being a regional reporter to covering the Justice Department to the White House to being a foreign correspondent to ultimately hosting All Things Considered for 10 years, that was the through line, was the curiosity. And it was a curiosity that started, as you say, when I was a kid in Oregon going for hikes with my parents.
And your parents encouraged that curiosity. They didn't shut you down in any way.
Oh, no, to the contrary. It was something that they were engaged in too. My father introduced me to mushroom foraging. My mother was really interested in wildflowers and used to keep a wildflower diary of what we would see on the hikes. So they didn't only encourage it, they also modeled it.
Yeah. The do you still go out in nature? Do you still find that it is a place where you can go and find something important?
I have two dogs now, and so I walk them twice a day, and it's fun, especially, this time of year when we're going from winter into spring to recognize what's blooming that wasn't blooming yesterday, or what birds I'm hearing that I haven't heard for a few months because they're just coming back to the DC area. DC doesn't have as many great hikes as Oregon has, but I still do like to be outside. And I also now have a garden. And so when you spend a lot of time gardening and growing vegetables, you notice small things, whether it's pests or butterflies, pollinators. And so it's that act of paying attention that I think really helps sort of shift the pace at which your mind goes. And especially right now when we're so glued to screens so often, being able to look up and look around and use all of your senses, I think is really satisfying and powerful.
I will say we're taping this in early March in Vermont, and we won't see spring for another 6 weeks. So thank you
Sorry.
for telling us that somewhere there's spring. You went to Beaverton High School, and you write about this again extensively in your book. You realized that you were gay, and you actually came out in high school, which I think was an extraordinarily brave thing to do. This was years ago before it was perhaps as common for people to do this. Can you tell us a little bit about that experience?
Yeah, I came out in the 90s at the end of my junior year in high school. So I was 16 years old. And the thing that I realized was that as sort of an honors student with a lot of extracurricular activities at my big public school, who then on the weekends went to this all ages gay club in Portland, Oregon called The City, I was kind of able to walk between worlds and perform these acts of translation and be almost an ambassador in a way that I later understood could be useful as a journalist. So people at school might have had opinions about gays and lesbians, but had never knowingly met one before until they met me. And I wore a pink triangle pin on my backpack. It was a symbol of gay pride in the 90s that was more common before the rainbow flag sort of took over. So there was no question and no ambiguity. Everybody knew that like I was the gay kid at school. And so they were able to take something that might have been abstract or seem foreign or distant or maybe even a little scary and put a face to that idea. And that was something that I applied to journalism when I would travel to foreign countries and meet people in situations that seemed wildly distant and different from anything that NPR listeners would experience in a typical day. I was able to use those skills as an ambassador, as somebody who can kind of walk between worlds to perform those acts of translation and help people relate to something that might seem very distant from their own experience.
You also said something that I thought was important, and I'll quote, when closeted people ask me whether they should come out, I sometimes tell them that it can give others an opportunity to surprise us by being their best selves. And you mentioned that, for example, one of the star football players in the team sort of came and told you that, if anyone gave you any problems, that he was going to take care of that. So, yeah.
Yeah, people can surprise you. People can step up in ways that you might not be expecting.
And then you came down to Washington. I'm sorry, you went to Yale, where you
Yeah.
studied and also discovered you had a love of theater and musical theater and a cappella. What was that like at Yale?
I loved being at Yale because everybody there had a passion about something, whether they were athletes or chemists or performers or sculptors. Everyone was passionate about something, and it tended to be something that went beyond just their schoolwork. And the friends that I made in college are many of the closest friends I have today. I was just yesterday talking to my former college roommate who lives in Los Angeles, and it we talked about how as a kid, that sort of curiosity and love of learning laid the groundwork for what I went on to do as an adult. That was also something that was really exciting at Yale because you would be in this mix with all of these people who not only came from very different backgrounds, but also had very different interests and passions. The common thread was that everybody had a passion for something, even if it might have been wildly different from anything that I personally had experienced before.
You went, and then following Yale, you went down to Washington, um, and started your career at NPR. Along the way, you met your husband, Michael, who's now your husband, and you talk about this in the book. Not only your meeting, but the fact that I think you actually went through 3 different wedding ceremonies, if I remember, beginning in 2004 when Gavin Newsom sort of opened the door, at least unofficially, and then on to some additional weddings. How did that transpire?
Well, yeah, I think people forget that in the very early days of same-sex marriage, there was this era where first you might be able to get legally married in Canada, but it wouldn't be recognized in the US. But then Vermont started offering something called civil partnership. So people would go to Vermont and get a civil partnership, but that wouldn't be a wedding. And then gay marriage became legal. And so suddenly they could go to City Hall and get a legal marriage certificate and so there were people who were married several times to the same person. When Mike and I got married, it was 2004. Gavin Newsom was the mayor of San Francisco. He's now governor of California, and he just decided he was going to start doing same-sex marriages. This was something that had been legalized in Massachusetts, but otherwise it had not really taken off across the country the way it would over the subsequent years. Mike grew up in San Francisco, and so when San Francisco started performing same-sex marriages, he said, "This is really important to me. Let's go do this." So on just a few days' notice, we flew to San Francisco. We showed up at City Hall. We exchanged rings. We exchanged vows. But then the California Supreme Court said, hey, a mayor can't just unilaterally decide that same-sex marriage is suddenly going to be legal. So all of those marriages were annulled, and we actually got a check in the mail refunding our marriage certificate application fee. I think it was $25. We never cashed the check. We saved it. It's in a box in the basement somewhere. But then, since that was annulled, we went the following year and we did a real wedding that we took time to plan, where we invited family and friends, and it was jointly officiated by his family rabbi and my family rabbi. But again, that was not a legal wedding. That was just a religious ceremony. So you get the idea.
But you are now officially married, and he works in Washington, D.C. area, and of course you've been based in D.C. So you covered the Justice Department for 2 or 3 years or more?
5 years, actually.
5 years.
Yeah, it was 5 years through the end of the George W. Bush administration and the beginning of the Obama administration.
Those were controversial years in George W. Bush's administration, obviously, as we went to war in Iraq, and there were domestic concerns about the power of the government in terms of investigations. Were there any major stories that you followed in particular?
Oh, the big legal debates in those days were about torture and treatment of detainees, and whether you could disappear people who were detained in Afghanistan to CIA, they were called black sites, and then how interrogations were conducted, and the memos that the Justice Department had produced authorizing interrogation techniques that on their face looked like torture. And there were also questions about domestic surveillance. So it was a lot of war on terror issues about the scope of presidential power and the ability of the president to do things without input from Congress, debates that we are still having to this day, some 20 plus years later.
You then moved into the London Post. No, I'm sorry, the White House Post.
Yeah. So after 5 years covering the Justice Department,
right.
I went and covered the White House for 4
Covering
years
Obama.
in the
And
Obama
you
administration.
describe that in your book. What was that? You talk about being in the bubble with the president,
Mhm.
what it was like to travel in a presidential motorcade and in the Air Force One at times, and getting to know President Obama a little bit over the years. What were those years like for you?
It was an absolute whirlwind. The big difference for me between covering the White House and covering the Justice Department is that the Justice Department, I felt like I could attain mastery of the subjects that I was covering. And so over the course of 5 years, I felt like I had a really good stable of people I could turn to who were experts in the issues that came before or came out of the Justice Department. In contrast, at the White House, you could one day be talking about nuclear regulatory policy and the next day be talking about state elected electors. The next day you would be talking about war powers. The next day you would be talking about climate change. And so it was completely unpredictable from one day to the next. You had to be incredibly agile and nimble. And tying back to what we discussed just a few minutes ago, comfortable waking up in the morning knowing nothing about the subject that by the end of the day you would be expected to sound something like an expert on, at least for 4 minutes.
You talk about the press too, and you may have had some concerns that it would be very competitive, and I suppose there is some competition, but that there was also a great deal of collegiality among the White House press corps, and that shared information at times, helped each other out,
Yeah.
which was nice to
Yeah.
hear.
And even to this day, I still, think about the people who I covered the White House with, who were White House correspondents when I was there. Casey Hunt, Jake Tapper, Major Garrett. These are people who I still have connections to and think very, very fondly of because of the sort of gauntlet that we ran together during those years of covering whatever came out of the White House from one day to the next.
Well, and I would say the gauntlet they're going through at this time, trying
Yeah.
to cover this White House.
Yeah.
You did say that with all the travel and all the hotel or motel rooms when you were on the road with the president, you said, quote, "Sometimes I would make a point to end the night with a local beer from the hotel bar," unquote. Why was that important?
Well, sometimes when you are going from the motorcade to Air Force One to a rally back to the motorcade, and you might be in 5 states over the course of a day in the height of a presidential campaign, by the time the day ends, you have no idea where you are. And so the idea of going to the bar at whatever chain hotel you might happen to be in. It's, yet another Marriott. When I covered the Romney campaign, we always stayed in Marriott's because the owner of Marriott was a supporter of his campaign, I believe. Anyway, when we would finally land at the end of the day, we would roll up to the bar and say, "Give me something local that's made here." And you would feel like, okay, even if the carpeting looks exactly the same from one state and one hotel to the next, this thing that I'm drinking was made in this place that I am. And it gave me a sense of kind of grounding, of actually being somewhere for that moment.
Yeah. You sampled a lot of beers.
Yeah, I guess so.
There is there seems to have been among the press a sort of gotcha journalism, though, or at least some parts of the press, when it comes to these presidential candidates and others. What was your feeling about that? I mean, by gotcha, I mean that they're waiting for any kind of mistake that a candidate might make. Did you see that, or how did you sort of guard against that?
It just depends on the news outlet. I mean, I think there's always been tabloid journalism that's sort of looking for the sticky viral moment. That was never really what I tried to focus my energies on. Sometimes things would become so all-consuming that you would have to pay attention to it, even if you didn't think it was necessarily the most important story. But I think often what politicians call gotcha journalism is just journalists focusing on something that the politicians would rather the journalists didn't focus on. It's hard to respond to the blanket term, but on a story by story basis, I just every day tried to answer the question, what is the most important thing for our listeners to know about today?
And what did you base that on? Did you, from listener feedback or your producers, or how did you decide?
Journalism is an art, not a science, and it's collaborative. And so I would talk to my editors, I would talk to other White House correspondents, and I also used my editorial judgment. At the end of the day, it's not formulaic. It is a sense of when 12 different important things are happening, how do you prioritize what is the most important? And people of good faith might disagree about the answer to that question. The nice thing about being in public radio was I always knew that the answer was informed by journalistic ethics and values and not by the business interests of whatever a corporate owner might think, because we didn't have that influence.
Right. And you're talking now about NPR, which is
Yeah.
right, which is a public outlet.
Mhm.
So then you had a chance to go to London as a foreign correspondent, and a very challenging time in the world. I don't know when it hasn't been challenging, but
I was gonna say, I'm not sure there's ever
right.
been anything but, at least in my lifetime.
But this was during the period also of the war in Syria, when over 1 million refugees were leaving Syria, and you were in some difficult and dangerous places during those wars, both in Iraq, Syria, when ISIS was at its peak. And you talk in the book about it's not a trivial thing to go into these areas and these situations, that there are, I think they had a transponder on you, so every 10 minutes someone was monitoring where you were back at home. So if you were taken prisoner, at least they would know where your last location was. And you had security experts advising you how to stay out of bad situations. But even so, sometimes it's impossible to avoid. What did it feel like to be there then?
I always wanted to help people understand the experience of folks who are living through these situations and not just exoticize the idea of war and covering a war as some sort of action movie heroic narrative. The experience of Americans in the last 100 years has been one of relative peace and calm and quiet. And so when we hear about wars happening on the other side of the world, it is easy to feel that they're happening to people who are different from us in some way. The phrase that I use in the book is war people in war
War
places, as
places,
though
yes, you do.
those are some kind of a different sort of human. And so whether I was talking to Iraqi fighters defending their homeland against ISIS or to Syrian refugees trying to flee to Europe, my goal was always to try to find a way to tell the story that would help listeners connect to that story and appreciate, oh, these people are actually not different from me in any fundamental, meaningful ways. So to give you just one example it's a story that I tell in the book, when I was in the coastal city of Izmir, Turkey, where a lot of Syrians were trying to find human smugglers to get them to Europe, I found this little cafe on a street corner, a kebab shop, where the owner had set up folding tables on the sidewalk. And on the folding tables, he had power strips. And in the windows of the cafe, he had posted the Wi-Fi network and password so that Syrian refugees who were in the midst of this very difficult migration could recharge their phones and could Skype or FaceTime with family back home. And I thought that is a detail that I need to include in my story because number one, anybody listening to this story would relate to the idea of having very little battery left on your phone and being searching for a place to recharge it. And number two, when faced with these stories of overwhelming human suffering, it's easy to feel like there's nothing anyone can do to fix it. But this story of this cafe owner was about somebody in their small sphere of influence taking a small step to make life better for those who were in this profoundly difficult situation.
The stories you tell are heartrending, and I agree with you completely that it does bring the war home to listeners in a way that mere statistics cannot. There has been occasional tendency in people who spend their life doing as war correspondents to get so involved in that life that they take risks that are a risk too far, we'll say. I'm thinking of Marie Colvin, for example. There's a movie about her called A Private War, starring Rosamund Pike. She was a great reporter, I think Pulitzer Prize-winning reporter, who was in Syria, had been previously injured in Sri Lanka and then went to Syria, and took so many risks that eventually Assad was able to find her and her photographer and killed them both. But the movie depicts her as being so caught up in the story and in the people that she was covering, who were suffering there, that she put herself and the photographer in ultimately fatal situation. Was there ever a moment when you felt you saw a line that you simply knew you should not cross?
Oh, so many. I mean, the before going into any kind of a dangerous situation, we do something called hostile environment training, where you basically spend 3 days with other journalists at a summer camp, and a bunch of retired special forces folks from the UK put you through all these scenarios of what to do if you come to a road checkpoint, or if you're taken hostage, or if somebody is shooting at you, or whatever the case may be. And so there, I mean, I haven't been in a situation where somebody is actively shooting at me, but I've been in situations where someone is shooting nearby, and then you fall back on the training from the hostile environment course, which is, okay, well, where's the nearest corner of the building, and how is the car parked so we can make a quick getaway, and at what point does it become too, you're constantly making these calculations, but it's not just gut instinct. There's a lot of training that we're given before we go into these kinds of situations.
The tragedy is now so many correspondents have been killed in Iraq and in Ukraine and in other countries. And it does appear that at times, and Gaza, it does appear that times that the press is actually being targeted now, which is something that I think previously did not happen.
I don't know if it's the case that it did not happen previously, but I do know that it's very dangerous to be a journalist right now. Palestinian journalists in Gaza especially have taken an unbelievable toll, both in that they are in most cases not allowed to leave, and that journalists from other countries, international journalists, are not allowed into Gaza to report. And we've also seen journalists killed, as you mentioned, in Ukraine and in Iraq and in many other places. And in many instances, it is the local journalists who pay the highest price. Every time I have been in a foreign country, I have worked with what we call a fixer, who's typically a local journalist who helps us find our way around the country. NPR tragically lost a colleague of mine named David Gilkey in Afghanistan, and also Zabiullah Tamana, an Afghan journalist who was working with David. And I think the stories of the lives lost too often tend to focus on the American journalists and less often on the local journalists who we wouldn't be able to do our job without them.
What was your experience in Ukraine?
I first went to Ukraine just as the war began in, I think this was 2015, which was not the full-scale Russian invasion, but it was rather a much murkier kind of Russia fomenting an insurrection that they tried to portray as an uprising from within Eastern Ukraine of people wanting to join Russia, when in fact there were Russian troops who were secretly working to create this appearance of civil war. And so, the phrase "the fog of war" describes the inability to know exactly what's going on in a conflict. And I experienced that very acutely because I was in these cities of Donetsk and Luhansk trying to figure out what was going on and how much was an authentic uprising and how much was being spurred on by Russia. It was a fascinating experience, and it built this sort of basis of understanding that became very useful when, some years later, Russia staged its full-scale invasion of the country.
Yeah. Do you have any thoughts about where this is heading?
I never try to predict things, especially not the future.
You had your production partner was from the BBC, and you write about him in the book, and they're actually somewhat comic, serious business, but comic moments. His name is Rich. You described him as your, quote, other husband, very platonic other husband. You worked very closely with him when you were overseas and in London. He was actually Scottish, and there's a quote you say, "About once a week, I would offhandedly tell him that he was fired. And he would remind me that as an NPR employee, I had no authority to fire him from the BBC. Then we would make our dinner plans together."
Yeah.
unquote.
Yeah. So every correspondent overseas for NPR has a local producer. And in London, there's an unusual arrangement where the local producer is a BBC employee who is assigned to a rotation for a couple of years to the NPR bureau. And Rich was my producer when I was in London. He's now an on-air anchor at the BBC. And so you might actually see him if you ever watch the BBC World Service TV broadcast. But he has had a few assignments in Washington, D.C., and he was just here a few weeks ago, and so we were able to have lunch and catch up.
He, well, the two of you were a great team over there. Other things that you talk about in your book, interestingly, you talk about the fact that you have a tendency to sweat a lot. And I'm only mentioning this because it's in the book, and that therefore
it was
being on
important
radio.
to me. It was important to me in the book that while I had chapters about war and human tragedy and refugee crises and mass shootings, that the book not feel overwhelmingly heavy. And so I quite deliberately, this book is not a beginning to end narrative. It's a collection of essays. And so I very intentionally interspersed between these stories of covering the war in Ukraine and covering the Pulse shooting in Florida, put in chapters that felt more like comic relief because I wanted people to be able to exhale and I wanted people to be able to sort of catch their breath before you plunge into the next thing. And in that sense, it's a bit like All Things Considered as a program where in a given hour, yes, you might hear about the latest news from the White House or the war in Iran, but you're also going to hear an interview with a filmmaker and you're going to hear about latest scientific discoveries. This book didn't have chapters about scientific discoveries or interviews with filmmakers, but it does have these kind of comic chapters and there are a couple musical interludes. And in that sense, I wanted it to feel almost like a 2-hour program of All Things Considered, where you get a little bit of a lot of things.
Well, it certainly humanizes you in the book. And All Things Considered, 10 years co-host. You just ended that run in this past fall. What a fascinating position to be in, to have that kind of freedom. Did you have the freedom to choose your topics, or how did you come up with topics every day?
Yeah, well, it's a mix. Obviously, as a daily news program, you have to cover what's happening in the news that day. And so if federal agents have killed an American in Minneapolis, we're going to be covering that story. There's no way that we're going to say, actually, I would rather focus on astronomy today. But if there is an interesting astronomy story, I also have the ability to say, hey, let's put this into the mix. We would have an editorial meeting every morning at 9:30 where people would say, here's a story I think is interesting. Here's a person I think is worth talking to. Here's a way I think we could approach this thing that is on the front page of the newspapers. And then as a staff, we all talk about what should go into the mix that day. And we talk about what is the most important story of the day. And we also talk about where is the joy, surprise, and uplift. And so collectively, we put together a show. And the host's voice carries a lot of weight, but it's not the only voice.
Yeah, I was going to ask you about that. Is there an Ari Shapiro type story that might, for example, be different than a Robert Siegel or an Audie Cornish story?
I think the stories that I, over my 10 years on the show, was proudest of often took something that was in the news and found a human way of talking about it that would let people understand and connect to it on a deeper, more personal level. So to give you an example, a project that I did after I finished writing the book was a journey from Senegal to Morocco to Spain, connecting the dots from climate change to global migration to political extremism, and tracing a journey through these countries and talking to people along the way. We took these big ideas, climate change, global migration, political extremism, and we showed not only how they were affecting individuals, but how they were connected to each other. So I hope that the kinds of stories I am most known for are those stories that take some big, overwhelming, complex thing and make it human, understandable, relatable, personal, and real.
And you have an audience, I think, an NPR, national audience, that is um, certainly open-minded, I think, and hopefully diverse. NPR is under obviously tremendous, I don't know if there's a word other than attack to use here, with its federal funding now being chopped. What will happen? What do you see happening in the next few years for NPR?
So one of the things that's been fun since I left All Things Considered is that I started a Substack, a weekly newsletter. It's free, people can subscribe, and on a given week, I might write about anything from regime change in Venezuela to what's growing in my garden. And several weeks ago, I had this big essay about whether NPR will be okay. And I think the short answer is there's going to be a couple years of struggle. And after that, I think NPR will be better positioned than a lot of other media organizations because it is completely independent and it is run by journalists and it is not answerable to a billionaire the way the Washington Post is or big corporation the way CBS News is. And so I think that independence will serve it well in the long run.
How do people reach your Substack, by the way?
Oh, it's just Ari Shapiro substack.com, and you can subscribe and you'll get me in your email inbox every week.
Okay, I think that's on my list. Is there, when we listen to NPR over the years, is there an NPR voice or cadence? Someone else has asked that once, that there's a certain cadence, it seems like, that announcers and personalities have that you can almost identify immediately, oh, that's an NPR voice.
Somebody once said to me, when you're on NPR hosting All Things Considered, you should sound like you've had exactly the right amount of sleep and exactly the right amount of caffeine. You're not over caffeinated, you're not under caffeinated. You're not drowsy and sleep deprived. You're not like just you want to talk to people the way you actually talk to people. And so you're not orating and shouting to an audience of millions, and you're not whispering intimate secrets in someone's ear. You're just talking to them. So that's the goal. And beyond that, I think we all sound very different, and I think that's a good thing.
And I know when I've driven different parts of the country, maybe some way out rural places where NPR may be the only national type broadcast you can get. It just seems so critical for this country right now, but that's my editorial opinion. I want to talk about your other career, which is as a musical performer, which, as we mentioned, started in college, if not before, and has really blossomed, and you've really become a professional on stage with the group Pink Martini. And I have to admit I had not heard about them until I read the book, but once I listened to some of their music, I was just blown away. They've been doing this for over 20 years, and you've been associated with
over 30.
30 years.
Over 30. They started in the 90s, yeah.
Group, very diverse kind of music, diverse languages, and you talk about some of your experiences as you began to sing with them. You had not been a professional, so it was a completely different thing you were trying. But you do appear in cities around the country. You've been in Burlington before. We hope you're going to come back. I think we do have a clip, and if you'll give us just a second, we're going to bring up a clip of you singing one of the well-known Pink Martini songs.
Finismati Fiteifa wak alber Na tinsanish Ana eine lekfi su'al Pardon tafin وحشني مدارم في سنين صبرت الحب راح وعمري راح ويا في الوحدة دي دلما وزاب وقرا لصورتك للذكريات في روحك Pardon
Can I ask you this? Is it a different feeling when you're on stage singing than when you are giving a speech or when you are on radio with national TV radio? Is that a different feeling?
Oh, for sure. I mean, singing with Pink Martini is such a collaborative project. There's about a dozen people in the band, and feeling the audience response in real time is such a different experience from a radio broadcast where there could be 5 people listening, or there could be 5 million people listening, and they could love it or hate it, or it could be background to something and they're not even paying attention to it. The feeling of everybody being in the room experiencing something together all at once has just a different kind of energy.
You've got some very serious singing chops there. And I mean, you really probably could have done that as a full-time profession. I don't know of any other national correspondents who have that ability to go completely in a different direction. So it's pretty impressive.
Thank you.
You also joined with Alan Cumming in the group Akanoy, and you performed in various, I think at the Kennedy Center and other notable stages. And you say, we had both spent our lives pursuing the same values, talking about you and Alan, empathy, connection, and listening. We had devoted our careers to telling stories in hopes of helping people better understand the world and one another. Are you still working with him, and what was that experience like?
We toured that show, Aachen Oy, for about 6 years. It was a 2-man cabaret show that we did together, and we did it for the last time in August. It was such a wonderful experience, as I write about in the book. And we're still close friends. He's like a big brother and a mentor, and I just saw him a few weeks ago in Philadelphia, and before that we met up in Palm Springs. When we did our show for the last time, he said, well, now that we're no longer going to have these tour dates together, we have to actually make a point to go out of our way to see each other as friends. And so I'm glad to say that we've done that.
Are you, so you'll continue with Pink Martini? Any other artistic projects on the horizon?
I've also been doing a solo cabaret show, and then I sometimes make guest appearances with other performers. It's a nice different tool in the kit that allows me another way to connect with people and another way to tell stories.
What made you decide after 10 years that it was time to move on from All Things Considered?
When I started hosting All Things Considered, I thought to myself, I've never done any job at NPR for more than 5 years, but this is such a rich vein to tap that I could imagine doing it for 10 years. And that number, 10 years, always kind of stayed in the back of my head as the amount of time that I thought I would probably do the job. And as I approached that decade mark, I felt like, yeah, this is the right moment. I don't want to ever sound like I'm burned out or checked out or over it or annoyed. I want to leave while I still enjoy the job, while I'm still stimulated by it and challenged by it. And so I did, and now I've been doing lots of other little projects. And it's fun to be able to say yes to things. While I did love hosting All Things Considered, it took up a lot of time. And now I have a little more free time to do things like this.
Well, your 2 dogs probably appreciate you having you home a bit more as well, I imagine.
Yeah, I'm sure they do.
Not to mention your husband.
Right.
Well, as the initial quote said, I mean, you probably should have been cloned, or you have been cloned or something, because you're still a young guy and you've got some interesting things ahead of you. I did want to ask you one question, because you've interviewed so many thousands of people. Some of the listeners might know I'm a physician, so when I go in for my annual physical, I'm always a little self-conscious because I kind of know what the doctor's going to ask, and I have to be sure not to step on his questions. When you're the interviewee, what does that feel like for you, having done so many interviews yourself?
For me, it's the difference between hosting a dinner party and being a guest at a dinner party. I love it because as the host, you have to make sure that the table is set correctly and the food isn't burned, and you have to think about who's sitting next to who and the flow of the conversation. As a guest, you just show up and enjoy. So being interviewed for me is a pleasure.
Well, and by the way, that meant you also talk in your book that you have some culinary skills as well, that you've really quite a good cook. So just to go with your multi-dimensional self. So I want to conclude. There's a quote in the book that you've tried to confront life's ugliness with beauty, meeting horror with humor, and smiling in the face of whatever comes next. I think that describes certainly your book and your career thus far. And we certainly thank you for being with us today here at CCTV.
Well, thank you so much for having me. It's really been a pleasure talking with you, and I appreciate the invitation to be on your program.
And we will follow you on your Substack and wherever else you might be. Thank you so much, Mr. Ari Shapiro.